Nico Iamaleava was not at SEC Media Days, but that didn't stop the Nico hype. Greg McElroy of ESPN and the SEC Network added a dose to the Nico train this week at SEC Media Days in Dallas when McElroy predicted that Nico will be among the Heisman finalists this year in New York. Welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside the Knoxville News Sentinel's Adam Sparks and John Adams. And guys, if Josh Heupel thought he would turn down the Nico talk at all by not bringing Nico to media days, I'm not sure he entirely succeeded on that front. Heupel was asked about Nico during his time on stage, and then McElroy made sort of an eyebrow-raising comment, not outlandish, but interesting nonetheless, when he suggested Nico would be a Heisman finalist. Now, I'm not sure we should put much stock in what Greg McElroy says, particularly as it pertains to Tennessee. I mean, it was just a few weeks ago that McElroy was calling Tony Vitello embarrassing for celebrating the College World Series, a strange take from McElroy. And if you remember, guys, last year around this time, McElroy was getting ready to build a statue for Dante Thornton, thinking that the transfer wide receiver was going to be so good for the Vols, and as it turned out, Thornton had hands of stone. So I'm not sure that I trust McElroy's analysis, but what do we think about the ESPN talking head identifying Nico as one of his potential Heisman finalists?
I mean, his argument was logical. Basically, McElroy's argument was he thinks Tennessee is a top 10 team, a playoff contender. And if they are a top 10 team and they are a playoff contender, their offense is going to put up big numbers, and the quarterback in that offense always puts up big numbers. And so if you're a top 10 team and you're among the leaders in the country in passing yards and touchdowns and total offense and all that, you have a pretty good shot. I mean, that was the formula for Hendon Hooker a couple of years ago. So I understand the logic, but it's got to be like A plus B has got to equal C. They've got to be better on offense than they were last year. They've got to fill in some holes there. They've got to be a contender for a playoff spot. And if all that happens, then I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, Nico does not have a real solid backup, so he's going to get a ton of reps. I mean, a ton of snaps. So he's going to have every opportunity to put up big numbers. And, if you look at, his first start in Citrus Bowl when he was the MVP, he didn't have huge numbers in that game. He passed for like 160 yards or something. But they were very conservative with him, and he still accounted for 4 touchdowns, 3 rushing, 1 passing. If you do that over 12 games, if he's got like 50 touchdowns, sure, yeah, he'll absolutely be in the hunt. So it wasn't really that strange. He's number 6 on the ESPN betting line of Heisman guys. And the logic, again, follows along what Greg McElroy is thinking, which is Tennessee puts up big numbers. So whoever their quarterback is, will be a Heisman, at least candidate, maybe finalist.
John, you like Adam and I are Heisman voters. Are you getting the pencil sharpened along with Mr. McElroy?
Yeah, I've already got a seat in first class on the Nico jet, to New York. He's kind of suspicious of Greg McElroy's take, though. It's almost like it's a makeup call. He obviously likes being popular because he just went medieval on Tony Vitello because Tony celebrated a national championship. I guess he should have done a Nick Saban and frowned and looked miserable and talked about how difficult it would be next season to repeat. Instead, he just celebrated wildly and had a great time. And McElroy had a problem with that. But then the next day, he apologized for what he said. So I don't have a lot of respect for that. I have more respect if you think Tony Vitello is an embarrassment, as bizarre as that might seem. Stick with it. Don't change the next day. So based on that, I'm wondering if McElroy will change his mind on Nico and say, I don't know why I said he would be going to New York. He's just a mid-level SEC quarterback, and I apologize for my earlier comments.
Yeah, it's funny, John. John, you said there that you got a seat reserved there in New York. It's funny that I thought about. I had a flight booked and a hotel booked for Hendon Hooker's appearance at the Heisman 2 years ago. Booked that in advance. Knew it would be hard to get. And I will now be using the flight credits for that I never used on the Oklahoma trip this year. And if you think about that Oklahoma game, if there was one game early in the year for Nico to say, I'm in the Heisman talk, it would be in a huge game that a lot of people are going to watch on the road in Josh Heupel's return. So quarterback and Josh Heupel will be the top of the topic. And that will be Oklahoma's debut in the SEC. Road game, tough environment. If there was ever a time for like Nico to put up big numbers and Tennessee to win, that would be it. He would be legitimately in the Heisman conversation if Tennessee was, would that be 3-0, 4-0, and if Nico played well in that game and Tennessee won.
I think the struggle with Nico that I have with Heisman comes at the end of the schedule. I mean, I agree with Adam that that's a chance for a statement game for Nico in week 4. I just question how many Heisman voters are paying attention in week 4. Like, so much of this award, fairly or not, and sometimes I think it's unfairly, is like a what have you done for me lately? Now, I think Jaden Daniels broke the mold a little bit last year. He was fabulous from wire to wire. His team was really good, but not great. But Daniels was so good wire to wire, he won the Heisman. But so often, it's like, what do you do in the month of November and conference championship weekend? I think back to Hendon Hooker not being a Heisman finalist in his spectacular season because he suffers an injury. Tennessee loses to South Carolina, and he's not playing in the final week of the season. And I feel like got snubbed, got overlooked in part because of what happened the last couple weeks of the season. And then I look at Tennessee's schedule, like there are not great opportunities for Nico at the close. I mean, he plays Georgia. Tennessee plays Georgia on November 16th, but that's a road game. If Tennessee loses that game, the other opportunities at the end of the year are Mississippi State, UTEP, Vanderbilt. Like, that's not necessarily the closing oomph you want to offer to Heisman voters. Nico may have a great game against Vanderbilt, sure. I just question whether anybody's going to be watching that game who has a ballot, maybe other than the three of us.
I think the playoff actually will open up the Heisman pool a little bit, because I think a lot of voters, when you look at who's in the playoff hunt, in the conference hunt, and all that, if you're going to go to if it looks like you're in line to go to the playoff, like there's this idea of, well, if they're going to the playoff, they've got to have a Heisman finalist. I mean, they just have to. You look at Michigan or Georgia, and you got to pick a player from that team to be a finalist. Otherwise, how did they get there? I think now that you'll have 12 teams in, it's going to open it up, number one, to more players, because you can just say, hey, you got 12 teams going in, 11 probably Power 4 teams. And so all these are sort of on the table. You can be the 10th best team, and your best player, your quarterback, let's say, can be a Heisman finalist, because you're not a team that didn't get there. You're a team that got there. So I think the pool will be wider, and it'll make more people legitimate candidates. That being said, I think that closes the door on players like Nico if Tennessee is not in the playoff hunt. And by the way, he can get in the conversation in the Oklahoma game. He can solidify himself on the short list if they were to beat Alabama, similar to how Hendon did. But yeah, then if late in the year, if you're rolling, the Georgia game, if you lose that one, could put you out. But I don't think it puts you out as much. If we think back to Hendon in 2022, was he not a finalist because he got hurt, or was he not a finalist because they did lose to Georgia and he didn't play great? I don't know. It's probably a little bit of both. But if Tennessee was going to be like the 7 seed or something that year, I think in the playoff, 6 seed, 7 seed, if Hendon Hooker doesn't get hurt, I think the chances are greater he would have been a Heisman finalist, because he would have led Tennessee to the playoff rather than not being able to get Tennessee into a 4-team playoff.
Yeah, I think the Georgia game is really important to Nico. It's later in the year. Everybody views Georgia as a a national championship contender, not just a playoff contender. If you do well in that game, also because Georgia usually has really talented players on defense, it's a road game. It's going to be under the most dire circumstances. So if Nico can uplift his team, he doesn't even have to win the game. I think if he performs really well in that kind of environment, that would be a big plus for him. And we're talking about going to being a finalist right now. I guess we should mention nobody from Tennessee has ever won this award. So a finalist would be a big deal. Peyton Manning certainly was up there as a finalist. I think Jaden Daniels, Blake, you brought up this. I think it's really important. And I try to do this as a voter. Sometimes players have stats that you just can't ignore. Jaden Daniels couldn't play safety for LSU last year and tackle somebody running for a touchdown, and that was happening every time you looked up with LSU's defense. And so LSU's not a playoff team, but its offense was just absolutely dominant. And he put up amazing stats as a runner and a passer in the nation's toughest conference. So I really didn't hold that against him that LSU wasn't as successful. And so I will always look at that. If somebody just stands out and puts up unbelievable stats, I'm really going to consider that. It's not his fault if his team isn't of the highest quality.
Well, on the flip side of that, I think if a team has a dominant defense or a dominant defensive player, it can hurt an offensive player on that same team to get into to get to New York as a Heisman finalist. If we think through this scenario where Tennessee is a playoff team, and I think we all agree that Nico probably, as a redshirt freshman, probably is not a Heisman finalist if Tennessee is not in the playoff. You know, if they're like the number 22 team in the country and they're 8-4, 9-3, he's not in the conversation. There's other guys in the SEC that would get there. But in this scenario where Tennessee is a playoff team, and let's say they're like 10-2 or something, if they're that good, James Pierce is probably really good. And that defense is better than it's been in the past few years. And so if you say, how did Tennessee get to the playoff? And your first answer may be James Pierce in that pass rush, and your 1B is Nico, I think that probably hurts his chances a little bit. Now, Tennessee fans wouldn't mind if they're in the playoff and they have two guys in the Heisman talk, but I do think if it's they got there a lot because of their defense and James Pierce, and then also because of Nico. The fact that Nico's a redshirt freshman, I think he would be looked at as a good, talented player, but maybe not the number one reason that Tennessee got there. It could hurt his chances, and he could also suffer from the youth element of it, where they say, well, he'll get there next year.
Adam, you may be giving Heisman voters too much credit. I don't know that the Heisman voter in Indiana or Wyoming, even if Tennessee is 10-2, is going to have any clue who James Pierce is, even though they may well should, knowing the way the voting for this award goes. It's like if you're not a quarterback or maybe slightly a wide receiver, you're often not considered. So James Pierce may get some consideration on your ballot, but I don't know that he's going to be taking votes away from Nico from that voter in Wyoming or Montana. That's
well, how's the Heisman? How are the Heisman's voting going to be this year? The fact that there's now 16 teams in the SEC and the Big Ten has like 500 teams, and you know what I mean. Used to it was only regional, and West Coast didn't look at East Coast or the SEC, and the SEC didn't look at the Pac-12. And now I think you're going to be more aware of more players because you cover them in your conference. I think that doesn't affect Nico, but I think that's going to be an interesting wrinkle in this, that we're going to know more without paying as much attention, so to speak.
I like Blake's take on this, though. Just not giving too much credit to Heisman voters. How many Heisman voters are there now? I mean, it's 900 and something. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, there are just a lot of people that aren't that aware of this stuff. And I think a lot of people have a regional bias. We don't, of course. We're above all that nonsense.
That's right.
Would not be impacted by any whatsoever. But yeah, when you talk about the Big Ten, and however, another way to look at that though is that Ohio State might be playing a 10 o'clock game on the West Coast, 10 o'clock Eastern time. So maybe some of those Heisman voters will already have called it a night, and so maybe they won't be seen as much. I guess the main thing I come back to with Nico though is kind of how we started this offense. Josh Heupel has a really good offense. It fits Nico's skill set perfectly, as it did Hendon Hooker's. So I just think all the numbers will be there. I think it's going to be incumbent upon the coaches not to think about getting Nico any more yards, not pushing the envelope on that, because you got to think about injury too. Tennessee was pretty good at padding Peyton's stats in 1997, I thought. Didn't take him out too soon. I don't think you can risk that with Nico. You got to be thinking about winning the game and winning the season and keeping him healthy. But I just think the numbers will be there, and he'll pass the eye test. So I just think it could come down to a lot of other SEC players too. How do they do? How does Carson Beck do? How does Jalen Milroe do? Jackson Dart, those guys?
Well, you're going to have an interesting scenario here with, giving reps to somebody else in a game, because normally you have your starter and then you have your number two that you want to keep happy enough, right? When Hendon was the starter, you could leave him in there for a while, but eventually, hey, Joe Milton's going to be the starter the next year. Milton's been around forever. So you give him, once it's a blowout, you give him his reps. Tennessee doesn't have that right now. Gaston Moore is the backup. Gaston Moore is a long-time reserve walk-on. So you don't have to make Gaston Moore happy. Like, Gaston Moore is not going to, walk out of the locker room and throw his pads down and quit if he didn't get enough snaps against Chattanooga in the opener. He just is what he is. He's a serviceable, capable backup. But then Jake Merklinger, their 4-star freshman, is the number 3. You'd like to get him some reps in a blowout, but then are you leapfrogging your number 2 to give reps to your number 3? I think not. I think they'll just leave Nico in a long time. And Josh Heupel has a funny way of, sort of rationalizing why he leaves his starting quarterback in and why he throws deep in a blowout late in the fourth quarter. It's always, we got to get reps to this guy, or, we may not get another chance. Game reps are different. And, we just want to try this one thing that we haven't tried in a game day situation. Josh Heupel wants to have his starting quarterback in there and to run the offense all the way down to the last 30 seconds and then put the walk-on in to take a knee. That's what he wants to do. And I think he'll probably rationalize a number of ways to make sure that Nico is in the game for a lot longer than you would think.
Yeah, let me translate that. Josh Heupel likes running up the score, and Nico is not going to be standing on the sidelines. There's not going to be any I agree with you, John. If it were me and the game was out of hand, I'd have Nico holding his helmet in his hand, thinking about the next week. But I've seen Josh Heupel coach for a long time now. If he has a chance to run up the score and pad those offensive stats, which is what Josh Heupel has hung his hat on throughout his career, he's going to do it. And, sorry about your luck, Eli Drinkwitz, if you happen to be the opponent out there. That's just Josh Heupel's way of doing business. So I don't have any questions about Tennessee's third-string quarterback, whoever it is, taking stats away from Nico. Nico's getting those stats.
But, boy, in that Citrus Bowl, I look back at it, he had 15 rushing attempts, Nico did. And I think they pulled him late in the game, 15 rushing attempts. Now, that was, I think, 8 sacks. And he held the ball too long, but he did run the ball some. But he got hit. You take away at least one of the touchdowns, he was untouched. He got hit 14 times plus some pressure. So he probably got hit about 18 to 20 times. They cannot let that happen. Because, again, if there's not a can't-miss backup behind him, Tennessee can be 9-3 or 10-2 with Nico. If you don't have Nico, that's a 6-6 type team.
Good coaches adjust and adapt. If your scenario plays out, Josh Heupel will be opening himself up to all kinds of criticism. He's got to be careful with Nico. He cannot. I mean, he needs to come out of the game when you think the game's in hand. I know sometimes it's hard to tell, but if you're up on Chattanooga 35-0 midway through the third quarter, I would say that game's in hand, and I would get Nico out of there. If he doesn't do that, he would be jeopardizing his entire season for some stats.
But John, we gotta work on that 2-minute warning, that 2-minute offense. It was a 2-minute warning this year. The Nico this year has the earpiece in the radio device in his ear. We got to work through those kinks. Make sure we're on the same page. So if you're at 3 minutes to go in the game and you're up 56-3 on Chattanooga, you can't pull him because we got to work on these things. You're not going to get another chance in Neyland to work through these things. So that's why you got to keep Nico in.
Get the column ready, John. You said Josh Heupel will open up criticism. Get the column ready, because if Nico gets pulled before the fourth quarter, I'll eat this mug that I'm holding in my hand
No,
here.
You will not eat that mug.
And I'm not going to have to, because it's not going to happen.
I just can't believe that. Are you telling me Nico will be playing for the entire third quarter against Chattanooga? You don't.
Well,
really
John, we got to get
on.
that. We got to get that first drive after halftime, because you got to see how he is coming out of the half, making adjustments. And then we only got a field goal out of that. We didn't get a touchdown, so we need to go back and fix what happened on that first drive. And that drive looked good, but look, now we're coming down to the end of the third quarter. We want to talk to the backup quarterback between quarters, not just toss him out there. And so let's go ahead and have Nico just hand the ball off a few times. And he also needs to work with the backup center. The center is not going to know how to snap the ball to Gaston Moore. He needs to know how to snap it to Nico in case he ever needs to start. And look at here. Now we're 12 minutes left in the game.
Adam has become Josh Heupel in front of our very eyes.
Yeah, right. You guys are joking. I just don't believe you guys are serious about this.
Get the column ready, John. Get it ready. As we talk about, though, I mean, we're sitting here in the middle of July. I know it's talking season. This is what pundits do during this time of year. You throw some names around for Heisman talk, right? But it's just the way things happen. However, how much hype do you think is too much hype for a guy who, he was a 5-star quarterback. He looked very, very good in a bowl game against Iowa, a bowl victory against Iowa. I didn't think he looked like a complete product yet, but hey, he's a true freshman. It was his first career start, and he looked darn good. So, I mean, I'm bullish on Nico as well, but I'm wondering in your guys' minds, and John, you got a lot of perspective here covering Tennessee quarterbacks over the years, some of whom were very, very highly regarded, who lived up to the expectations, some who didn't. I'm just wondering, should there be any caution here? Not that Josh Heupel can control it. I mean, he tried to control it somewhat, I think, by not sending Nico to media days. You can't totally control it. But do you think there is the risk here of maybe too much hype, too much, flowers being handed out to Nico here 6 weeks before the season starts?
Well, I don't think so, because I think his talent is so obvious. And everything I've heard about him, what he's done in practice, how good he is in terms of not just physical skills, but some of the intangibles, about how well received he was by his teammates, and how he seemed to handle all. Remember, he's had a lot of hype coming out. He had a lot of hype coming out of high school. So I think he's accustomed to this. So I think he can handle all that. But just watching the guy play, it wasn't his stats against Iowa. Iowa wouldn't turn anybody's heads. But if you watch the game and watched what he did, I think he has the Heisman, all that Heisman hype is really valid, because we're talking about a 6'6" guy that is so quick and shifty and can throw the ball all over the field. I just think the guy's going to be a superstar.
He's used to this attention. Now, the pressure is a little different If you can be the scapegoat of a loss or a bad decision in a game. So that will be different. I mean, there's some stuff that he's going to face that he hasn't faced before. But he did live for 2 or 3 years with the tag of number one quarterback in the country at his age or his class. So he's used to that. I think also there's a number of these guys that are this age that are used to cameras in their face, that are used to everything is live all the time. They're used to getting a lot of attention as a celebrity much, much, much younger, much earlier than this, say, let's say like a Peyton Manning or a Heath Schuler would have had. I was in the Knoxville airport a few weeks ago this summer, and I was traveling with my wife to Seattle. She had some students on a it was a national competition. They were going to Seattle, and so I went with her and noticed a few Tennessee football players were going to be on her flight. Jackson Moy, the Stanford transfer, I think an offensive lineman, and then Nico. Basically, these were flights going to the West Coast. So Nico was on her flight with some family members, and I just kind of sat back and watched how he worked with. I think a couple of his sisters were there, and he went over to like the little food court area there to get something to eat or drink or whatever. And his sisters sort of camped out and watched all the different groups of people that were going by that were recognizing him. And my wife had some students, 5 girls there that saw him, recognized him. I went to like the other side of the airport. I didn't want to be part of like the autograph seekers there, but they stood in a group there and waited for him. And then Nico's sister motioned them over, and they kind of arranged as he would like a publicist or something. Would you like a photo with Nico? Yes, we would. And so he came up and posed and did the photo and said hi to all of them, and then went back to what he was doing. And then I think maybe a few minutes later, somebody else recognized him. They went through the whole drill again. And so he's been accustomed to being a celebrity, despite the fact that he's only like 19 years old. And he's been that way for at least a couple of years. And so the idea that like being betting odds of a Heisman candidate are out there for him, I think that's pressure, but I think he's had like 10 other facets of that type of pressure before that sort of just like flows in the same river with him.
Blake, you've covered the SEC. You've seen all these other quarterbacks that we're talking about as Heisman candidates. Jackson Dart at Ole Miss, Carson Beck at Georgia, Jalen Milroe at Alabama. What did Milroe? Didn't Milroe finish? I want to say 6th last year in the voting. Is that right? Something like that.
Yeah, that sounds right. He was just on the outside looking in of the finalist cut. I think 6th is about where he was. Yeah.
Which of these quarterbacks would you take all those quarterbacks ahead of Nico right now if you were getting ready to go play ball with your team?
I don't know about going to play ball with my team, but in terms of Heisman candidates, I think Milroe and Carson Beck are probably stronger preseason Heisman candidates than what Nico is. I would probably take either of those guys if I needed to win a big game at this point too, just because they've been through the rigors of it before. I mean, Jalen Milroe, didn't have a sensational game against Michigan, but he was the reason Alabama was leading Michigan in the second half of that game, which they ultimately lost in overtime. But, in no small part because of Milroe, Alabama was a couple yards away from beating Michigan and being in the national championship game last year. Carson Beck didn't have a great game in the SEC championship. Otherwise, he was so solid wire to wire throughout the season. But yeah, I mean, I think Nico probably fits into that conversation of being like, 3rd or 4th best quarterback in the SEC as it stands, right now. I mean, I think it would be tough to elevate him above guys like Milroe and Beck just because we've seen what they could do. And some would even put Quinn Ewers in that conversation as well. Now, Nico could climb throughout the season. I think he's going to have a lot of factors working in his favor, like Adams talked about. He's going to have the stats. I think Tennessee's going to be in playoff contention, but when you go up against a couple other guys that I think are going to be potential Heisman finalists, like a Jalen Milroe, like a Carson Beck, I think part of Nico's candidacy will depend on, does he outplay the guy on the other sideline in those games. I mean, if we think back to 2022, the final spot to being a Heisman finalist sort of came down to Stetson Bennett or Hendon Hooker. And I'm not saying all voters looked at it that way, like, oh, do I vote for Hendon or vote for Stetson? But that was sort of the dividing line of being a Heisman finalist. Stetson Bennett did outplay Hendon Hooker on that particular day in Athens. And then Stetson Bennett was very, very good in the SEC championship game, that final taste in the mouths of voters before they had to send their ballots in. So I do think with Nico's candidacy, a lot of it could come down to how he plays in those games, those big spotlight games against Alabama and Jalen Milroe and against Georgia and Carson Beck, because there's only 3 spots on people's ballots. Like, that's the thing I think people forget. We don't forget it because we're voters, but maybe fans don't realize there might be 4 finalists in New York. I think some years they've had even 5 finalists in New York, but you only get to vote for 3. If you got a ballot, you get to vote for 3. And, I mean, I think for a lot of voters, you might put 2 SEC quarterbacks on your ballot. Would you put 3, or would you go with maybe a Big Ten player? And if Milroe and Beck are occupying 2 of those spots, that makes it tough a little bit for Nico to get some breathing room, I think.
Yeah, I think Nico probably could be similar to Jackson Dart, a guy that's his team's going to have somewhere between a good and a great record, and he's going to put up a lot of big numbers, but may not be a Heisman finalist. Which, by the way, I think Tennessee fans would be perfectly fine if Tennessee was 10-2. They were in the playoff. Nico had good numbers, but not record-breaking numbers. I think they would be perfectly fine with that, because then they would say, "Hey, you got your quarterback," and like what we said, some of the voters may say, "Man, he'll get there next year. He'll eventually get there, just not this year."
All right, let's close going around the horn here, and say yes or no. Do we think Nico is going to be a Heisman finalist with some rationale? Now, if we're wrong, we don't have to pull a Greg McElroy and apologize, because we're not comparing Nico to a WWE heel like McElroy compared Tony Vitello to. Even if he's not a Heisman finalist, I think we all believe that Nico is bound for a big season. But I'll start. Yes or no, is he a finalist? I lean no, because I agree with what Adam said earlier. I think your Heisman finalists are going to come from playoff teams. And I'm sitting at 9-3 with Tennessee, which would mean almost certainly they're not going to be a playoff team. I think it's going to take 10-2 to get Tennessee to a playoff team. I think Nico is going to have a very nice season. I think he would enter 2025 among the Heisman frontrunners, but I lean no on him being a Heisman finalist at this juncture, because I don't have Tennessee right now on the right side of the playoff cut.
I would go no. Whether or not Tennessee gets in the playoff, I would say no, because it's going to be too crowded of a field with a lot of good quarterbacks, a really good quarterback class this year in the SEC. And because the SEC will get 3 or let's say 4 teams in the playoff, then each of those quarterbacks are then candidates. And when you have older established guys like Beck and Milroe and Ewers and Jackson Dart, that's 4 guys right now. We hadn't even gone outside of the SEC, because so Nico could be the 5th best quarterback in the SEC and not even get close to New York as a Heisman finalist. So for those reasons, I would say no.
Well, I was kind of, on the borderline there. I wasn't sure, but you guys convinced me that Josh Heupel is going to pretty much play Nico every snap this season. So based on that, I'll say, yeah, he'll be in New York with just unbelievable stats if he's still able to walk.
Well, book your plane tickets now, John. If you're not able to use them, Adam has informed us that you can save them for a couple years, save the credit, and just fly to Oklahoma City for a game in Norman at a later date. Well, there will be plenty more Nico talk, I'm sure, in the weeks to come, and I'm sure we will contribute to it. So thanks for stopping in and checking us out today on this edition of the Volunteer State. We'll be back with you soon.